Well, here we are, the final power rankings video of the 2022 Overwatch League regular season. Playoffs are just around the corner, so let's talk about who's looking good and who took a notable hit. Here's my post-Summer Showdown power rankings, mostly based on performance. This video will be largely based on separate regional rankings, with an overview of my overall rankings at the end, plus a summary of who rose and fell the most compared to the previous power rankings video during the mid-season madness. Let's begin over in the West, and coming in at number 13 is the Paris Eternal. With one map win on 6 tries, they are absolutely the worst team in the league as it currently stands. Their new roster did not quite have the experience or star power needed to keep up with all these teams who have been together for months now. It's to no fault of their own, because Paris as an org are simply in a rough spot, but it's the truth. The new players just aren't good enough to compete in the Summer Showdown. They were the worst performing team and is really not all that close. Sorry Paris fans, but the suffering will most likely continue as we end the year. It is simply too late for a turnaround. Moving on to number 12, you've got the NYXL. Unfortunately for New York faithful, your team made little to no progress in Stage 3. There was a glimmer of hope after that reverse sweep against Houston, but that's kind of where they peaked. It still largely felt like this team was living and dying by the hands of Yaki. Technically speaking, this was their best stage of the year so far, but considering that they got a lucky reverse sweep and were the only team to give up a map to Paris, that's really not saying all that much. But at this point, a miracle run is going to be required if they want to turn their season around. But with how boomed their mental seems to be, I'm not getting my hopes up. Number 11. The Boston Uprising. After the events that transpired this stage, it is painfully clear that Boston have been somewhat held back by their coaching. This decision to try and replace Punk at every corner has clearly backfired. He may not be Korean, but his consistency has been the thing that has kept this team together this year. Boston got 2 quality wins this stage with him in the starting lineup. Now, I would have considered putting Boston up a little higher because of their achievements, but the rest of their stage was just less than ideal, and if we're going off everything they did, then obviously they just cannot be any higher. Number 10, the Atlanta Reign. I mean, yeah. This team suffered a major setback compared to their first half of the year. The new meta caused some issues for them, it would seem, and it never really got any better. Maybe it has to do with adding a few new pieces into the lineup, or maybe it was simply because of the double main support meta that made it so Ultraviolet was less enabled. I wouldn't say the Reign were terrible this stage, but they either lost to or performed worse than a lot of teams that I have higher in this ranking. Talent-wise and in terms of proving themselves, they're obviously not the number 10 team in the West, but for this stage, they clearly were that level, you know? They underperformed greatly and there's no denying it. They really need to do a lot better moving forward. Up next at number 9 is the Vancouver Titans, and oh baby, this is not something I was expecting myself to say. The Titans haven't been this far up in a power rankings video of mine in years, and some might argue they should be ranked even higher than this. Let me explain. For starters, the Titans deserve a lot of credit for what they did. To make a tournament and look very competitive throughout is a huge accomplishment. This team rallied around their second chance at life, and to be honest, they ran with it. I absolutely love the fact that they beat the Justice and gave the Shock a good scare in the first round of the tournament. Suddenly there is hope to make the play-ins come October. But in terms of their performance this stage, it's maybe a little overrated in my opinion. They had a lot of fun games, they were enjoyable to watch, but they also took advantage of a couple of weak opponents with not much to show afterward. They lack the results that I'm looking for. They're improving rapidly for sure, but the threat factor is not fully developed yet. Moving on to number 8, I have the Washington Justice. Before I get into it, yes, I still do have Washington over Vancouver despite their loss to them. The Justice generally had the more impressive stage, seeing as they beat a couple more relevant teams and took the likes of Dallas and San Francisco to a map 5 each. The Titans just don't have that same resume. Anyway, 8th place is still something Washington fans should take great pride in. After all the recent drama that's occurred within your org, they really just didn't have a right to be in a the tournament to begin with, so the fact that they were there is really awesome, and I mean on top of it, they beat London and swept Florida. The issue is, they also had a lot of downs, such as the couple of reverse sweeps that they suffered. Too much inconsistency to truly warrant a high placement here. I appreciate the resilience, but there were a lot of chokes and, quite frankly, questionable moments. They're a cool underdog to root for sure, but they still have a long way to go. Number 7, the Los Angeles Gladiators. This is where there might be some controversy. Considering this team went 2-4 and missed the tournament, you'd expect them to be lower than the likes of Vancouver and Washington. But the thing is, LA simply feel like the better team, and they honestly did perform just as well as those guys if you look at things like map wins. Some people forget that the Glads were literally 2 maps away from being 4-2 rather than 2-4. They couldn't clutch out the big wins, but they did stay relevant. They did more to impress me from a competitive standpoint, and it seemed like they got better in those last couple of weeks. However, they still have to plummet in your rankings for this stage, regardless of any defenses you can make. Going from back-to-back tournament titles to missing the Summer Showdown is a pretty bad look. They weren't all that great on the Junker Queen comp. Reiner just wasn't that same player we'd gotten accustomed to watching, and I think maybe the team felt a little lost without Patty Pan and Shu. The Glads were not clutch and had a very average stage. Let's just pray that it was the meta and not a deeper cause for concern as we head towards the playoffs. Anyway, coming in at the number 6 spot will be the London Spitfire, who managed to stay exactly where I had them at the mid-season mark. In general, they did enough to stand their ground. Their start was maybe a bit shaky, but their strengths in a brawl meta like this one slowly came to the forefront. Hadi and Sparker were true leaders out there. They played some excellent Overwatch as they led their team to a couple of major wins, and I appreciate their efforts. However, they were far from great. There were a lot of weird moments for London this stage, and I'm not just talking about that reverse sweep by the hands of Florida. Every time it seemed like the Spitfire were about to rise to a higher level, they just have one of those weird performances where they choke it all away, and we'd be left wondering what their actual progress was looking like. The confidence in some of their players really seems to fluctuate on the regular. It's very bizarre. They can never maintain that momentum. They were very respectable still in the Summer Showdown, I'd say, considering some of their other achievements, but they just weren't groundbreaking. On the topic of the Florida Mayhem, they're actually up next at the number 5 spot. It feels weird putting them this high after their pretty inconsistent qualifier, but when push came to shove, they really did show up when it truly mattered. That's the big factor that separates them from London. They know how to adjust. When they get tried and tested, they play their hearts out. A singular map away from what could have been a top 3 finish in the tournament is something to be proud of, especially after the rough start. Taking out London and Vancouver and then nearly Toronto is some noteworthy stuff. They kept on showing us exactly why they're a dark horse threat. They showed tremendous improvement over a short amount of time while verifying why people like Majed, Someone, and Checkmate are always worth keeping an eye on. I'm pleased with how good Florida can play when the lights are at their brightest, and I believe they'll walk away from this stage feeling pretty confident as the play-ins approach. Number 4. The Houston Outlaws. If we're being real with ourselves, the only reason Houston get a slight bump up in the rankings is because the rain and the Glads fell as hard as they did. The Outlaws simply did not do much of anything. It was the same old that we've seen all season long, basically. The only difference this time was that they overcame the Glads and maybe had a bit more hype surrounding them thanks to the efforts of Pelican and Merritt on DPS. The Outlaws in general, I think they played just fine for their standards. The problem comes through that anti-clutch factor and going above and beyond. A prime opportunity to make a deep run this time around was completely wasted. You generally could argue that Florida and London had the better stage, but I for one believe Toronto were just a bad matchup for them at the time. Maybe it's copium, but I blame the preparation. I refuse to call them worse than some of these other teams I know they can beat, especially when they had a pretty solid qualifier. The Outlaws are consistently a top 5 or better team in the West, but now they just have to take it to the next level and show us that they're capable of more. Kicking us off at the top 3 will be the Toronto Defiant. Side note, don't expect this ranking to last. Call me a hater if you want, but Toronto maintaining this height seems very unlikely. But for what it's worth, I'd say that the ranking at this point in time is well deserved. They took care of business in the qualifiers, and it carried over into the tournament with a solid losers bracket run. They They played well in front of their home crowd. The DPS were genuinely solid, and I believe that everybody else played with confidence and intelligence behind them. They finally managed to be a major threat in a tournament setting after all these years. The only hope now is that this level of confidence can carry over into a new potential meta and maybe even into the playoffs. If they could keep this level of play up, then this is going to be a scary team to deal with for anybody in the play-ins. And now at number 2, we've got the San Francisco Shock, and no surprises here, right? They were clearly the second best in North America. They were very strong across the board and got excellent performances out of their Prodigy and Proper, as well as Violet, who really is making that aggressive Lucio work. I'm proud of him. The Shock were pretty much rolling through everybody. At the end of the day, Dallas were literally their only blemish on an otherwise fantastic stage from a really good team. The Shock have already locked up a playoff spot thanks to their second consecutive silver medal at a tournament and have a great shot of getting the number 1 seed in the playoffs. What was there not to like about their performance? I think the team did a really good job of playing around Proper yet again. Kilo seemed to come into his own on Sojourn, Kaluj and Finn flexed onto new heroes pretty well, and Violet's Lucio is looking better than ever. The only concern really I'd say from a result of this stage is this inability to make it to the top. They can always get awfully close, but there's always that one team who seems to get in their way. It hurts their credibility individually, but also from a trust perspective. That concern of them not being championship caliber is going to haunt them until proven otherwise. Are they always going to be the second fiddle this year? Time will tell. And at number 1 is none other than the Dallas Fuel. They finally had their coming out party this year. The potential of 2021 has been reawakened as they were without a doubt the best team in the West. 6-0 in the qualifiers is impressive as it is, but to get better and better and learn things as the tournament is going on is just amazing and shows how legit they are. There was constant improvement and their synergy shined brightly. Hanbin made a case as the league's best Junker Queen and as a potential MVP candidate again, and I'd say that Edison really came into his own this stage. When he's playing well on the Sojourn and the Ashe, it enables Sparkle and Hanbin the most. It seems like when he's the one getting denied, that's when Dallas struggled the most. But in general, during this stage, they were unstoppable. Now the Fuel seem poised to make a late season title push, and there is a solid chance that they continue to build upon their momentum even if the meta changes, because that's just the type of team they are. Now that Dallas have their confidence back, they're going to be scary. There's not much else to say though. The Dallas Fuel are the best. So that's going to do it for the Western Conference. I'd say the big takeaway here is that someone finally, other than the Gladiators, occupies the number 1 spot, and also that the Titans actually crawled their way out of 13th for once. Your biggest winners compared to last stage are Vancouver, Dallas, and the Defiant, who all jumped up 3 spots each. And your losers are absolutely the Gladiators and the Reign, who plummeted 7 and 6 spots respectively. This meta really shook up the pecking order in the West. I mean, absolutely wild stuff. But can the same be said for the Eastern Conference? Kind of. Starting us off at 7th, you've got the LA Valiant. Like I said previously, we can't entirely blame this team for their terrible performance, because if your work conditions are poor, then it's naturally going to affect your play. But on top of that, I would say that their synergy was maybe lacking a bit. The consequences of running a mixed roster reared its ugly head, and I think also it doesn't help that the support line maybe struggled in terms of synergy and finding the right lineup choice. And on top of all of that, they lost multiple map 5s again and seem very untrustworthy to be clutch when they have to be. And it gets worse for this group, because their head coach No Hill recently resigned from the team. Everything is literally falling apart at the worst moment. They better pray that the next meta is absolutely perfect, otherwise I fear their season is actually over. Number 6, the Hangzhou Spark. What a fall from grace. This did not look like the Spark from the first half of this year. If we rate their performance this stage, it was obviously bottom 2. The lack of synergy and lifelessness that I saw with this group is kind of concerning. You could tell that it really bothered the players that they were struggling, and that could be a scary thing. When a Chengdu team becomes unsure of themselves, that's when you start to panic. And honestly, I fear that is the territory we are currently moving towards. You promoted Neko and Taro as new supports? Why? Please don't tell me they're actually going to be the new support line this late into the season. I understand that maybe Super Rich and Irony could have done better last stage, but this seems, well, extreme. Neko is literally your coach and has not played professional Overwatch in quite a bit, and Taro has not touched support at the Overwatch League level before. This smells very fishy. Is this team unraveling? I pray the answer to that is no, but let's move on to the number 5 spot where I have the Chengdu Hunters. I don't know, man. It seemed like this meta was not going to be great for them at the start, but after the first few weeks, I kinda thought they were going to make the tournament. It's very disappointing to see them come up short. I'd say that Leave, Jinmu, and Gaga all had bright spots, but a brawl-like meta like this one just does not suit Chengdu's playstyle. Splitting people up and making those individual plays and causing chaos is way more up their alley. Without that ability to play whatever they want to, they're not that hard to figure out. But I mean, in general, if we look at their entire year, they've been pretty mediocre. They just do not have that firepower or even the coaching, I'd say, to compete this year. I gotta keep this team exactly where they are. They have not proven that they deserve to be any higher. They do just enough to not be considered a bottom feeder, but they truly are middle of the pack at best. Number 4, we have the resurgent Guangzhou Charge. Much like their Vancouver counterparts over in the West, the Charge made the most of a new opportunity as a bottom tier team. And I'd say the Jimmy pickup in particular bore a lot of fruit as he absolutely crushed it on the Sojourn. The Charge had their best performance in a stage since 2020 and now have a 2-point lead over the Valiant for the final play-in spot in the East. Between the new guys and Choice A1, the Charge looked pretty respectable out there. The fact that they were able to move so far up and turn their season around in half of the time it took them to get one win in the first half of the year is amazing. But I wouldn't really count on a second stage of this caliber. Their team is much improved now, but it's hard to say if they just took advantage of other teams in their region faltering or not. I'd like to see the Charge prove themselves a bit more before I'm willing to call them a true threat. But who knows? Maybe with some extra firepower and Piggy, maybe they have what it takes. Should be pretty interesting to see what they're made of. Coming in at the number 3 spot, though, is the Philly Fusion. It feels bizarre putting a 2-4 team this high, but there's no denying that they played very well in the last couple of weeks. The moment that they reincorporated MN3 into their lineup, they started banging out some pretty impressive performances, win or loss. They proved that at full strength they are better than the Charge and that maybe the reverse sweep against them was a fluke, but then they also took a superior Seoul team to a map 5 twice. They won a tournament game and were the only team during the qualifiers to take a map off of the Dragons. But unfortunately, their improvements came a bit too late. As their DPS line and Fury got more comfortable in this meta, 2 other teams had already established a chokehold over the rest of the East. Philly played well enough, and that's something I appreciate, they never gave up, but they seriously lucked out in this situation. They literally did the bare minimum while watching other teams crumble around them to make this tournament. And because they didn't really get any significant wins per se, their overall performance this stage was just okay, and they're clearly number 3. On the topic of the 2 teams that had a chokehold over the East, next up at number 2 is the Seoul Dynasty. And just like the Shock, they were the obvious number 2 in their respective region. They played very well until they ran into one specific roster, and I'd say that deserves a lot of credit, right? If only one team in the entire region can beat you, you're definitely doing something right. Seoul found a good system that worked for them in the Junker Queen meta by capitalizing on Prophet's experience on Brigitte and Stalker's incredibly high potential. This comp worked well for them because Seoul are a flexible roster with a lot of consistent pieces. Everybody had their downs, but in return, there were double the number of ups. Seoul's preference to play around one another really benefited them in this meta. They had a great grasp on how to play this new meta with confidence and with aggression. They're a top team in the league for sure. I mean, they were the only team to actually somewhat push the Dragons this stage. There's no shame in coming in second for the simple fact that the one team ahead of them is on a different level in the Junker Queen meta. And that, my friends, is of course the Shanghai Dragons. I mean, there's really not much to be said in terms of performance here. A 6-0 stage, 3 dropped maps in total when including the tournament, a first place finish, and some elite play from the entire roster. This was the bounce back opportunity that Shanghai were looking for. A meta where synergy is the priority really works to their advantage, seeing as this group has been together for almost 3 years now. I mean, compared to all of the other rosters in the East, they have some big time leverage. But I'd also say a few of their guys really stepped up individually. the most notable of which definitely is Lip, who generally has been pretty underrated this year. I mean, this man is still a bona fide superstar. I still think that his sojourn might be one of the most underlooked in the entire league, and I'd say that his elite performance has put him into the conversation for MVP. The Dragons were without a shadow of a doubt the best team in the East. I mean, their level of understanding was so much higher than the rest of the opposition. It took Seoul 3 tries just to take maps off of them, for crying out loud. The Dragons honestly made it look so easy. This team is terrifying when they start to click, and now that they've rediscovered their top form, just like the Dallas Fuel, the rest of the league should be in huge trouble. The Dragons are once again the kings of the world, and it's going to be very difficult to take that crown away. And on that note, there's your rankings for the East. The Dragons are of course the ones who won the most in this scenario, as they not only jumped up multiple spots, but also claimed the #1 spot for the first time since the preseason for me. But of course, the Charge also got a notable step up as they finally aren't in last place. Going from 7th to top 4 is a pretty big deal. When it comes to the loser side of things, the only team to really fall off significantly was the Spark, as they dropped a staggering 4 spots and now have many question marks surrounding them. And that basically concludes my Eastern and Western regional rankings, so how about we move on to a brief summary of what my performance power rankings would look like when combining the two regions. For number 1, I decided to go with the Shanghai Dragons. Them and Dallas are very comparable, but I'd say that Dallas actually showed some struggles from time to time, unlike the Dragons, who are basically in control always, so I'd say that warrants the top placement. Congrats to the East, someone has finally taken over the #1 spot from the West. When it comes to both my number 2s from each region though, I went with San Fran over Seoul because I believe they performed slightly better. If you're wondering why Toronto are ahead of Philly, it's simply because the Defiant beat more noteworthy opponents. Then I know the Houston rating may be a little high, but I'm going to keep them there because of Copium. Then you have the Glads, who are still a lot better than most of the teams who made the tournament, I'd say, and Guangzhou get the nod over the Titans and Justice for having a better overall stage. When considering who benefited the most from this stage, it's honestly pretty crazy with some of these numbers. Guangzhou, +9. Toronto, +7. Then Dallas, Shanghai, and Vancouver all +6 compared to their previous spots in my mid-season madness overall rankings. But with drastic changes for winners also comes drastic changes for losers. The Glads took a huge hit, going from #1 all the way to 10th. But then the Spark and the Reign, I mean, they took it the worst by far at -12 each compared to the mid-season madness. A few others had some changes as well, but I don't think anything compares to these 3. Take these rankings with a grain of salt though. It's kind of hard to compare regions when they literally don't play each other in a stage. It's all very messy and kind of just more so for fun, you know? But that's basically what I came up with, which means that we're done with this video. What are your thoughts on my list, and what do your power rankings look like heading into the final stage? Let me know down in the comments below. And if you enjoyed today's discussion and you want more content just like this, be sure to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel if you're new. And until next time, this is ATP, signing out. Peace.